The thing about Cedar Grove is that it feels like it hasn't changed in decades. I've lived here my whole life, and when I look at photos of my parents in this same town, standing on the corner near Watson's Market or smiling outside the old library, everything seems exactly the same. Same streets, same buildings, same families, generation after generation. It's as if time decided to let Cedar Grove be, untouched by the rest of the world moving forward. I never thought of it as strange until I left for college. When I'd come back for breaks, I'd notice things I hadn't before, little things that never struck me when I was younger. The paint on the library always looked fresh, yet I'd never seen anyone repaint it. The same barber, old Mr. Sweeney, still ran his shop, but he hadn't aged a day since my high school years. It wasn't until last fall, during my first year back home after college, that the kids started standing out. First, it was easy to brush off. Kids change, and when you're away for a while, you don't expect to recognize every face on the playground or remember all their names. I convinced myself that I was just out of the loop. But as fall rolled around again, I noticed the pattern repeating. The same eerie glances from children who should have been familiar, but weren't. It wasn't just that I couldn't remember them. It was like they were fundamentally different from any kids I'd grown up with, as if some part of them wasn't real. Their eyes held a vacancy, a strange hollowness that seemed unfit for children. They'd gather in small, hushed groups on street corners, pausing whatever they were doing to stare at anyone who walked by. And they rarely smiled, at least not genuinely. When they did, it was a tight-lipped, thin kind of smile, one that felt calculated. It was almost like every year they were resetting. Last week, I'd seen the girl on Evergreen Lane with her friends. The group had been standing in a loose huddle, whispering, when they noticed me. She broke away from the others, her dark hair framing a face that looked older than her years, yet blank, devoid of any recognizable emotion. She was the one who'd spoken, telling me that cryptic message, "It's almost time." After that night, I kept seeing her around town. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Cedar Grove isn't big after all. But soon it started feeling more intentional. Every time I looked up, she was there, standing in doorways or sitting on curbs, her unblinking stare fixed on me with that same unnerving intensity. In Cedar Grove, there's a certain rhythm to life. Our seasons are distinct, almost theatrical. Winters are brutally cold, with snow blanketing every inch of town, while summers are hazy and hot, the kind where even the mosquitoes seem lethargic. Fall is when the town really comes alive, with harvest festivals, football games, and bonfires down by the lake. But this year, even the familiar comfort of fall felt tainted. I kept my head down for a few days after the encounter, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I even tried to brush it off with my mom one evening over dinner, but the words came out wrong. I mentioned seeing strange kids around, hoping she'd say something comforting, maybe that I was just overthinking things. Instead, she paused, looking at me with a faint, almost sad smile. "You know, honey," she began, setting her fork down, "I remember you saying something similar last year." I frowned, trying to recall. "I did." She nodded, her eyes softening. "Around this same time, actually. You mentioned some of the kids seemed off." I tried to brush it off with a laugh, but her words planted a seed of doubt in my mind. If I'd noticed something strange last year too, maybe it wasn't just my imagination. I started paying more attention, watching the kids a little closer when I walked around town. I'd see them standing in clusters after school, rarely playing the way kids normally do. Instead, they'd huddle together, their heads bowed as they whispered in low voices, casting furtive glances around as though they were hiding something. One evening, as I walked past a playground near the edge of town, I saw a few of them gathered around the merry-go-round. They were completely silent, each child sitting cross-legged, facing inward, their backs to the world. They didn't move, didn't laugh, didn't shout or scream like you'd expect kids to do. They just sat, their heads tilted downward, their bodies eerily still. A chill ran down my spine as I watched. It felt wrong, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see. I thought about calling out to them, asking if they were okay, but a deep, primal part of me told me to keep walking, to avoid drawing attention to myself. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept tossing and turning, my mind filled with those vacant stares and strange whispers. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just kids being weird, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, around midnight, I got up, deciding that maybe a walk would clear my head. The town was dead silent as I stepped outside, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves as a cool autumn breeze swept through the streets. As I turned the corner onto Evergreen, I saw her again, the same girl from before. She was standing under a street lamp, her shadow stretching long across the pavement. Her face was turned upward, staring at the light as if transfixed by it. Her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide and unblinking. I froze, watching her, unsure whether to approach or to keep my distance. Suddenly, she looked straight at me. Her mouth curved into that thin, tight-lipped smile, and she began to hum softly, a low, tuneless melody that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. I couldn't make out the words, if there even were any, but the sound sent a shiver down my spine. It was a sound that didn't belong here, a sound that felt ancient and wrong, like something dredged up from the bottom of a dark, forgotten well. My feet felt rooted to the ground as she took a step toward me, her gaze never wavering. She was close enough now that I could see the reflection of the street lamp in her eyes, a faint, unsettling gleam that made her seem otherworldly. I tried to speak, to say something that might break the strange, oppressive silence, but my throat felt tight, as though some unseen hand was gripping it. "It's almost time," she repeated, her voice barely more than a whisper, but the words echoed in my ears, each syllable heavy with an unspoken weight. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the street. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring after her, my mind racing. Finally, I forced myself to turn around and head home, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, her words replayed over and over in my mind. "It's almost time." The next morning, I woke up feeling as though I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been plagued by that strange, haunting hum from the girl on the street, the way her voice floated through the still night air. I went about my morning routine, but everything felt out of place. The coffee tasted bitter, the sunlight felt too harsh, and every sound seemed amplified, as if my senses were on high alert. I decided I needed a distraction, so I headed downtown to run a few errands. The streets were quiet, more so than usual for a Saturday. Cedar Grove's small downtown was essentially just one long street lined with aging storefronts and a few newer buildings that never seemed to fully blend in. Today, even the regulars, Mr. Sweeney the barber, old Doris from the grocery store, and the young clerk at the hardware shop, seemed absent, as if they were all avoiding something unseen. Then, in the reflection of a shop window, I saw a group of kids standing across the street, watching me. It was unsettling, the way they stood in perfect silence, arms hanging limply by their sides, their eyes fixed in my direction. I turned to face them, but the moment they realized I was looking, they broke into hurried whispers. They huddled closer together, speaking too low for me to hear, yet never taking their eyes off me. It was a sickening feeling, being the subject of such intense, unblinking attention. As I continued my walk, I noticed more groups of children scattered throughout the town. They were in the park, standing at the edge of the basketball court, clustered around the bus stop, always in groups of 3 or 4. Their ages seemed to vary. Some looked barely old enough to be in kindergarten, while others seemed closer to teenagers. And each group had the same strange look in their eyes, an almost feral curiosity, like they were waiting for something. After a while, I found myself near the old community center. The building was in disrepair. It had been shut down years ago when the town could no longer afford to keep it running. Yet, as I stood there, I saw one of the windows slide open, and then a small hand reached out, gripping the windowsill. A boy climbed through, dropping down to the ground with a small thud. He was around 8 or 9, with sandy blonde hair and a thin, wiry frame. He spotted me almost immediately. I expected him to look away, maybe run off like most kids would if they were caught somewhere they weren't supposed to be. But instead, he just stood there, staring at me with the same empty, unreadable expression I'd seen on the others. His clothes were oddly clean for someone sneaking around an abandoned building, and his skin looked almost waxy in the pale morning light. The boy tilted his head slightly, his lips pressing together as if he were trying to decide something. Finally, he raised one hand and pointed at me. I stood frozen, a strange chill settling over me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Are you waiting for something?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. His mouth curved into a small, unsettling smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "It's almost time," he said, his voice soft but clear, echoing in the stillness of the street. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the same phrase the girl had used, and hearing it again felt like confirmation that something was horribly wrong. I took a step back, forcing myself to break eye contact. But when I glanced back, he was still staring, his smile never fading. Without another word, he turned and walked down the street, his steps eerily quiet. That evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself wandering toward the edge of town. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled there, as though some invisible force were guiding my steps. It was the part of Cedar Grove that most people avoided, especially after dark. The houses here were older, more spaced out, and several of them had been abandoned for years. I passed by the old Thompson house, a sprawling Victorian with peeling paint and broken windows, and then I saw them, dozens of children gathered in a loose circle in the overgrown field behind the house. They stood in perfect silence, their faces turned toward the center of the circle where a figure was seated, their back to me. It was hard to make out any details in the fading light, but the figure looked older, maybe in their early 20s. They wore a long, dark coat that nearly brushed the ground, and their hair was long, almost reaching their shoulders. The children were mesmerized, their eyes fixed on the person in the center. I took a step closer, my curiosity getting the better of me, and that's when I heard it. The same soft, haunting hum the girl had been singing the other night. The figure's head tilted slightly, and as I took another step forward, I saw their lips moving, mouthing the same tune. The melody was strange, unfamiliar, but something about it felt ancient. As the humming grew louder, the children began to sway gently, their eyes half closed as if in a trance. I was close enough now that I could see the glazed, vacant look in their eyes, their faces devoid of any recognizable emotion. I took a step back, my heart pounding as a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Then, the figure stopped humming and turned slowly, almost as if sensing my presence. I held my breath, unable to move as they looked directly at me. Their eyes dark and intense, filled with an unnatural depth that made my skin crawl. For a brief moment, I felt as though I were staring into the void, into something far beyond human understanding. The children turned to face me as well, their movements eerily synchronized. Their expressions remained blank, their eyes glazed and unfocused, but there was something in the way they all looked at me that sent a jolt of fear through my chest. Without a word, the figure in the coat raised a hand, motioning for the children to stay put. They began walking toward me, their footsteps silent on the dry grass. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, as if paralyzed by some unseen force. When they were only a few feet away, the figure stopped, their eyes boring into mine with a cold, unsettling intensity. They didn't speak, but I could feel something in the air between us, a silent communication that made the hair on my arms stand up. Finally, they raised one hand and pointed at me, their finger steady and unwavering. "It's almost time," they said, their voice low and echoing, carrying a weight that felt ancient, as if it were a message passed down through generations. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them turn and walk back to the circle of children, resuming the haunting hum as they rejoined the group. The children followed suit, their voices blending together in a soft, unsettling chorus that filled the air, carrying that strange, ominous melody into the night. I turned and stumbled away, my legs finally responding as I broke into a run. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I glanced back, half expecting to see them following me. But there was nothing, just the darkened field and the outline of the old Thompson house looming against the night sky. As I walked home, a single phrase kept echoing in my mind, repeating over and over like a broken record. "It's almost time." I barely slept that night, my mind racing with images of the children, their empty stares, and the figure humming in the darkness. The phrase, "It's almost time," echoed endlessly, like a warning that refused to be ignored. When morning came, I felt no relief, just an unshakable sense of dread. I tried calling my mother, a close friend from high school, anyone I could talk to, but no one picked up. The usual warmth of Cedar Grove felt hollow, the comfort drained from the familiar streets and houses. Desperate for answers, I drove to the town hall. Cedar Grove's history wasn't something people talked about. It was almost as though everyone simply accepted that things here had always been the same. But I hoped I'd find something, anything, that could explain the unsettling behavior of the children and the strange figure leading them. In the records room, I sifted through old newspapers, property deeds, and photos, anything that might reveal a hidden truth. Hours passed with no clear answers until I found an article from 1963, a story buried in the back pages. The headline read, "Asterisk asterisk mystery surrounds disappearance of local children asterisk asterisk," and my blood ran cold as I read the details. Every few decades, the article said, children from Cedar Grove would go missing in clusters, only to reappear days later, each claiming they had been away on an adventure they could barely remember. The article mentioned strange gatherings witnessed by locals, children huddled in fields or dark alleys, sometimes humming an eerie, tuneless melody. When the children returned, they seemed changed. They'd act differently, quieter, as if something had taken hold of them, some invisible force beyond their control. As I pieced together more articles, I noticed a pattern. These incidents seemed to coincide with the last full moon of fall, marking the season's end, as one of the articles phrased it. The children would disappear the night before the full moon, only to reappear the following morning, their memories clouded, their expressions blank. The townsfolk had long whispered that it was some kind of passing, a ritual they'd been too afraid to investigate. Tonight was that full moon. A chill ran down my spine. I had seen them, those kids, gathered in a circle, following that figure like they were entranced. But what were they preparing for? And why did it feel like they'd been waiting for me? When dusk fell, I felt compelled to return to the field behind the Thompson house. The quiet was oppressive, and the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I crept along the side of the abandoned house, hiding behind the crumbling walls and peeking out into the clearing. The children were there again, and in the center was the figure in the long coat, their back to me as they led the children in that haunting melody. But tonight, something was different. I could feel it in the air, a dark energy that pressed against my chest, suffocating and cold. The figure looked up suddenly, their head tilting as though they could sense my presence. In that moment, every child's head turned in my direction, their hollow eyes locking onto me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. The figure raised a hand, beckoning me forward. I wanted to run, but my body betrayed me, my legs moving as if controlled by some force beyond my own will. I stepped into the circle, the children parting to let me pass until I stood face to face with the figure. Now, in the light of the moon, I could see their face clearly. A young woman, her skin pale and her eyes dark as coal, bottomless, like two pits that pulled you in the longer you looked. She extended her hand, placing it on my forehead, and an overwhelming sensation flooded my mind. I was no longer in Cedar Grove. I was someplace ancient and dark, a place where shadows stretched endlessly, and whispers filled the air. I saw glimpses of children, their faces blank, their voices blending in that strange, wordless melody. I could feel their fear, their confusion, and something else, a deep, hidden understanding. They were vessels, part of something much larger, something ancient that fed on innocence and youth to sustain itself. And then I saw myself, standing among them, my face just as blank, my eyes just as empty. The woman removed her hand, and I stumbled backward, gasping for air. The children began to close in around me, their faces expressionless, their eyes glazed and empty. The figure spoke, her voice soft but powerful, echoing in the silence. "Every year, we gather," she said, her words wrapping around me like a cold fog, "to preserve the balance, to sustain what cannot be seen." I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. She continued, her gaze unwavering. "You were chosen as they were chosen before you, to return, to remain, and to keep the cycle alive." My heart pounded, my mind racing with a single, desperate thought. I had to get out. I turned and ran, pushing through the children, ignoring the hollow stares that followed me as I stumbled across the field. The whispers grew louder behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my chest heaving, every nerve in my body screaming to keep going. The next morning, the town felt different. It was quiet, too quiet, and the usual warmth of Cedar Grove seemed absent. I passed by groups of children on my way back home, each of them glancing at me with a strange, knowing look. They were the same children from the night before, yet there was something new in their eyes, a spark, a trace of something left behind. When I got home, I stumbled to my bedroom and collapsed on the bed, exhaustion overtaking me. I told myself it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel something inside me, a dark, gnawing presence that hadn't been there before. Days passed, and life in Cedar Grove seemed to return to normal. The kids were back in school, playing in the park, laughing and shouting as they always did. But each time I passed them on the street, they'd look at me with those empty, knowing eyes. And every so often, one of them would smile that strange, tight-lipped smile and whisper, asterisk, it's almost time, asterisk. The seasons passed in a blur, and eventually, the next fall arrived. By then, I'd accepted my place, the unspoken duty I now carried. I'd become like the others, one of the watchers, waiting for the children to gather, for the humming to begin once more. And as I stood at the edge of the field that following autumn night, watching the children gather in a circle around the new figure, I felt that familiar chill settle over me. I knew the cycle would repeat, that the chosen would carry on the tradition, as they had for generations. I knew, too, that I would be there, just as that figure had been before me, guiding the children, sustaining the balance, keeping the town's dark secret. Because here, in Cedar Grove, time doesn't move forward. It simply repeats, and each year, the children return, changed and ready, as if drawn by an unseen force. And we, the chosen, are there waiting, watching, and whispering to the next in line. Asterisk, it's almost time. Asterisk. And I could hear the faint sound of Peter exhaling, like he was choosing his words carefully. I told you, he said softly, that the story needed to be personal, real. You were the one who brought him back, not me. You gave him life again. I don't understand, I said, my voice cracking. He's dead. I can't have. It doesn't matter whether he's dead or alive, Peter interrupted. What matters is that you opened a door that connects your past to your present. And now you have to close it. I felt my stomach drop. How? How do I close it? There was another pause, this one longer, and I could hear a low hum of static in the background, like the connection was deteriorating. You need to finish what you started, Peter finally said, his voice lowering. You need to write the ending. The ending? What are you talking about? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. The boy, Peter continued, his tone almost clinical. He came to you because you left his story unfinished. You've been living with that guilt for years, trying to bury it. But now you've brought it back to the surface. And the only way to put him to rest is to give him an ending. I shook my head, pacing the room, unable to comprehend what Peter was asking. You mean I have to write him out of existence? Yes, Peter said. You need to let him go. You need to finish the story. If you don't, he'll keep coming for you. He'll get stronger. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It sounded insane, but after everything I had seen, there was no denying that something real, something dangerous, was happening. I had no other choice. I hung up without saying another word, threw the phone on the couch, and rushed to my desk. My laptop was still open, the unfinished story staring back at me. The cursor blinked, waiting. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys. My heart pounded in my chest, fear clouding my thoughts. Could I really do this? Could I just write the boy away? I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began typing. The boy's face filled my mind, his rain-soaked body, those dead, empty eyes that had haunted me for so long. I pictured him standing there on the side of the road, his life ending too soon because of a careless moment. The guilt surged through me, but I forced myself to keep writing. This time, I didn't just write about the accident. I wrote about what came after. I wrote about the boy's parents, how they had forgiven me, how they had moved on. I wrote about the boy finding peace, moving on to whatever comes next. I gave him an ending, a proper one, not the abrupt, violent one that had haunted me for years. As I typed the final words, something shifted in the air. The oppressive weight that had been bearing down on me lifted, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe freely again. I finished the story, saved the file, and leaned back in my chair, exhausted. It was done, or so I thought. The soft knock came again, not from the front door or the window this time, but from the wall right beside me. I turned, heart racing, expecting to see the boy standing there once more. But the room was empty. The house was still. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and walked over to the wall where the knock had come from. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed my palm against the cold surface. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible voice whispered from the other side of the wall. "Thank you." It was the boy's voice, but this time it wasn't filled with anger or accusation. It was calm, peaceful. I pulled my hand away from the wall, my heart still racing, but the dread that had been gnawing at me for so long was gone. The house was silent again. The weight lifted. I stood there, breathing in the quiet, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. I had given him peace. I had given myself peace. I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't because of fear. It was because, for the first time in years, I felt free. The next morning, I sent the story to Peter. No reply came, no payment was transferred. It didn't matter anymore. I didn't hear from Peter again, and I didn't need to. The boy was gone. The door had been closed, and I wasn't about to open it again.